How's it going? And many blessings. That's a pretty hard act to follow. But God bless the work and the mayor of Memphis for the work that he's doing. I want to give you a little background on myself. So I actually started out in the White House as a director of urban affairs and revitalization for the Trump administration. I now serve as the deputy assistant to the president for the Office of American Innovation, which I'd love to get back to explaining what that office does. But I think it's important to add context by telling you a little bit about myself and where I'm from. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio is in here. Go Browns. And I grew up as a son of the crack cocaine epidemic. The crack cocaine epidemic took down my mother, my parents, as well as uncles and aunts, and not just me, but almost every family in my neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland, a neighborhood that was a growing middle class in the early 80s that were also victims of deindustrialization and jobs moving overseas. And this is important because that's the story of so many different communities. I grew up seeing communities like Huff. It's a neighborhood in Cleveland that's looked the same almost since the riots of the 60s. And we've talked a lot about Dr. King's legacy, and we've talked a lot about the communities that he wanted to empower. But so many of those communities have been in isolation and in distress. And I'm one of those individuals who was able to make it out of that community. I was blessed to have a father who survived the drug epidemic and encouraged me to go to college. And my mother eventually survived. And I had somewhat of an infrastructure to support me going to Howard University. Now, most interesting thing is I never thought I would go to Howard University and become a black Republican. But God has a funny way of doing things. But my hope becoming a finance major was to create some infrastructure that can empower communities like the communities I grew up in. Because I saw a lot of individuals beside me who had talent but ended up in the criminal justice system or ended up in addiction. And I was blessed because I've fallen down and getting back up a couple different times. And I spent time even after college working in the financial services industry before I gave my life to God and moved back to DC. And in that movement, 11 years ago, I remember sleeping on maybe like 6 or 7 different couches, just turning my life over and said, God, look, I'm just going to try to serve. And I got an opportunity to intern for then Congressman Pence, not knowing that one day he would become vice president. And then I spent some time on the Hill figuring out ways for Republicans to get more engaged in solutions to poverty. And I'm not talking about poverty alleviation where we're just trying to figure out how to reform our welfare system, but how do we really economically empower people? Well, I can say through the grace of God, I think we have that infrastructure. That infrastructure is right here underneath our feet. I worked with Senator Tim Scott as his economic advisor, and we came up with this idea that created opportunity zones. Opportunity zones was a part of the president's tax reform plan, and the Investment and Opportunity Act allows for tax deferral investments to go into some of our most distressed communities. Why is that important? Because regardless of politics, and it's probably shocking you to hear someone from the Trump administration say this, but regardless of politics, we need to unify for those communities like the communities I grew up in, because they don't have time to play politics. You have communities that are suffering from the opioid epidemic, still people suffering from the crack epidemic. We have a community almost right around the corner here in Atlanta that Dr. King grew up in that's just not flourishing, and it's an opportunity zone. But in order for us to use this infrastructure, capitalize on this access to capital, It's going to take a partnership, a five-way partnership: federal, state, local, private sector, companies, individuals, nonprofits, faith communities. And then the fifth person, or the fifth partner, being the people that we empower, the people who get access to capital to start a business, the people who get affordable housing, the people who get a job at a manufacturing plant, the people who are actualized to get on the ladder towards success. And so the time is now for us to work together to use this infrastructure to empower our most distressed communities. It was a blessing to be invited here by John and participate with the organization that he's developed, because at the heart of it, you gotta have the economic empowerment piece. Around that, we can build the social impact hub that can deal with creating safer communities, helping with workforce, helping with addiction. The White House created this Opportunity and Revitalization Council that will take $20 billion of federal resources for economic development, for entrepreneurship, for safe communities, and for workforce, and donate and focus those funds, cross-coordinated, to have a holistic approach to build around this infrastructure for economic development. But again, that's just the federal tools that we have to facilitate. In order for us to actualize them, we need local strategies, local entrepreneurs like yourself, local nonprofits, local churches. There are people in this room from all walks of life. And if anything that you can take away from my conversation is learning that that infrastructure exists. And now is the time that we can use this infrastructure to help empower our most distressed communities. And so I look forward to continuing to have this conversation. Our team will be traveling across the country, having these conversations, sharing with everyone the tools we have available, and encouraging state and local government and private sector organizations to do their part. Because again, these communities can no longer wait on help. The time is now. Let's empower our communities. Let's empower this country. And together, let's empower the world. Thank you so much.